Dear friends, in every age, faith has been both a light and a fire. It guides the lost, heals the broken, but when twisted, it can burn. In the United States, a nation built upon both freedom and faith, this paradox is deeply personal. From church pews in small towns to the bustling streets of New York, people long to believe. Yet belief without discernment can lead the soul into darkness. In the 1970s, the world watched in horror as more than 900 followers of the People's Temple drank poison in Jonestown, convinced they were entering heaven. Many of them were ordinary Americans, teachers, workers, parents, longing for purpose and belonging. What began as a movement for justice ended in tragedy. And even now, decades later, the echo of their voices reminds us how easily devotion can become delusion when separated from truth. Faith without humility becomes self-worship. Passion without prayer becomes power without direction. That's why the Catholic Church, even in modern America, still guards its teachings with wisdom and discernment. As the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops reminds us, the rite of exorcism is never about human power. It's about submission to God's authority. The priest does not command demons by his own voice, but by the power of Christ who conquered evil through obedience. There's a quiet lesson in that. True strength in the spiritual life doesn't roar, it whispers. It doesn't display miracles for applause, it bows its head in surrender. In the noisy world of social media, where many claim to speak for God, the greatest act of faith may be to listen, to silence our own egos long enough to hear the whisper of grace. Many Americans today are searching for meaning in a culture that celebrates independence, yet hungers for connection. That longing can drive people toward communities of love or toward manipulation dressed as religion. Psychologists studying cult behavior, such as those cited by Verywell Mind, found that most recruits weren't irrational. They were lonely, idealistic, and deeply sincere. They sought belonging, not bondage. But the same yearning that opens the heart to God can also make it vulnerable to those who promise certainty in exchange for surrender. The gospel warns us, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. In a country that prizes freedom of belief, discernment becomes not just a virtue, it's a safeguard for the soul. True faith liberates, false faith enslaves. Think of America's story, a land that once welcomed pilgrims seeking religious freedom, yet also saw waves of fanaticism, from witch trials in Salem to the modern cults that prey on fear. History teaches us that every age must rediscover the difference between conviction and control. Real faith, as the saints remind us, is not about controlling others, but transforming oneself. It is the quiet courage of the nurse praying before her shift in a New York hospital, the father forgiving his son after years of silence, the college student choosing honesty over popularity. These are the miracles of ordinary holiness that never make headlines, but shape eternity. So the question remains, not only for Americans, but for every believer. Do we seek God, or do we seek our own reflection in His name? The answer lies in humility. In every culture, every language, the truest act of faith begins not with "I know," but with "I trust." Dear friends, faith is not a fortress. It is a journey. It is a fire meant to warm, not to destroy. When we learn to walk humbly with our God, we rediscover that freedom and faith were never enemies. They are two wings of the same soul, lifting us from darkness into light, from pride into peace. Dear friends, faith, at its heart, is meant to set us free. But when passion becomes obsession, when conviction loses compassion, the very faith that should liberate the soul can begin to bind it. In every era of history and in every corner of America, we've seen this transformation, when the voice of God is drowned out by the noise of human pride. Across the United States, the hunger for meaning runs deep. People long for purpose, for community, for something greater than themselves. That longing is sacred. Yet in moments of fear or uncertainty, it becomes fertile ground for manipulation. History is filled with names that prove how devotion can be twisted. In the small town of Waco, Texas, in 1993, believers followed David Koresh, convinced he was a new Messiah. They studied scripture, prayed daily, and sang hymns about redemption until fire consumed their sanctuary. Not long before that in California, the group Heaven's Gate sold all their possessions, waiting for a spaceship to carry them to salvation. These weren't villains, they were seekers. But as one survivor later said, "We thought we were serving God, when really we had made a God in our own image." Sociologists and psychologists in America have studied this phenomenon for decades. They call it religious absolutism, the belief that one's own understanding of God is not only right, but perfect. It's a mindset that thrives in isolation and fear. Dr. Margaret Singer, a pioneer in cult research at UC Berkeley, once observed that most cult members didn't lose their minds, they lost their freedom to question. That sentence should echo in the conscience of every believer. Because faith without the freedom to question is no longer faith, it's captivity. The danger of zealotry lies not in its fire, but in its blindness. When a movement demands total obedience to a human leader, or silences every doubt, or divides the world into us and them, it no longer serves God. It serves control. Even within the church, leaders from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops have repeatedly reminded the faithful that the voice of truth is never shouted, it is discerned. The gospel doesn't call us to dominate, but to love, not to judge, but to heal. America's own story is woven with this tension. From the Puritans who fled persecution but became persecutors themselves, to modern culture wars fought in God's name, we are constantly challenged to balance faith with freedom, zeal with mercy. In a land where personal conviction is sacred, the temptation to turn conviction into weapon is constant. And when that happens, devotion turns dark. Think of how it begins, not with hatred, but with fear. Fear of losing identity, fear of being wrong, fear that truth might be bigger than what we can control. And so people retreat into echo chambers, online or in person, where everyone agrees, where every opposing voice is labeled evil. But real faith thrives in tension, not certainty. Real believers don't fear truth, they chase it. Jesus never built walls, he crossed them. He didn't create tribes, he called fishermen, tax collectors, zealots, and sinners to the same table. He didn't say, "Be right, but follow me." And that's what fanaticism forgets, that love, not correctness, is the mark of discipleship. Modern America has its own saints of discernment. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "The time is always right to do what is right." His faith made him fearless but never cruel, bold but never hateful. He faced mobs, prisons, and violence, but never lost compassion. That is zeal purified by love. That is what faith looks like when it walks humbly with God. Yet even today, the cycle repeats. On social media, self-proclaimed prophets promise healing, fame, or financial blessing in Jesus' name. They sell miracles like merchandise. They use fear of the end times to gain followers. But as Scripture reminds us, not everyone who says to me, "Lord, Lord," will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only those who do the will of my Father. The will of God is not control, it is communion. Dear friends, zeal is a gift, but without humility, it becomes poison. The cure for fanaticism isn't apathy, it's love that listens. It's the willingness to admit that I might be wrong, that others might see a side of God I've yet to understand. The truly devout don't imprison truth inside their walls, they follow it wherever it leads. Maybe that's why Christ chose fishermen and not scholars. Fishermen know that storms come. They know the ocean is bigger than their nets. They know humility is the price of survival. Faith, too, is an ocean, wide, deep, sometimes terrifying, but always filled with life. When we let go of the need to control it, we finally learn to float. In every church, in every heart, the choice remains the same. Will my devotion bring light or shadow? Will it unite or divide? The world doesn't need louder believers, it needs gentler ones. those who carry truth not as a sword, but as a lamp. Dear friends, in a culture that celebrates independence, the word obedience often feels uncomfortable. In America, we are taught from childhood to stand tall, to chase dreams, to break boundaries. Obedience sounds like the opposite of freedom. Yet in the language of faith, obedience is not submission to power. It is the posture of love. It is the act of saying, God, I trust you more than I trust myself. Every day across the United States, millions whisper that prayer without realizing it. A firefighter stepping into flames, a nurse walking into an ICU after a sleepless night, a teacher returning to a classroom full of struggling students. They obey not out of fear, but out of love, for duty, for compassion, for something greater than comfort. That is the quiet strength the gospel speaks of. Surrender that transforms ordinary people into instruments of grace. In a world that prizes control, surrender feels like defeat. But Christ himself, who could command the seas and silence demons, chose obedience even unto death. Not my will, but yours be done. In those words lies the mystery of true power. The Son of God didn't save the world by asserting dominance, but by accepting the cross. And because of that obedience, every chain of sin was broken. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops once wrote that obedience is not weakness. It is the courage to align one's heart with divine wisdom. It is what allows the Church to remain grounded even amid confusion. The exorcist, as the USCCB reminds us, acts not in personal authority, but under the permission of the bishop, because evil fears not the human voice, but the voice of obedience to God. The lesson is the same in everyday life. Obedience is not about control, it's about relationship. It's about learning to listen, to parents, to conscience, to truth, even when it's inconvenient. American society often equates strength with self-reliance. But the saints and even our nation's greatest moral leaders have shown that true greatness is found in service. Think of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in Birmingham jail, writing words that still echo through American history. I am in Birmingham because injustice is here. His obedience was not to man-made laws, but to a higher moral law. It was obedience that led him to nonviolence when the world demanded retaliation. It was obedience that made him powerful, not powerless. In another time and place, Sister Helen Pragin walked the halls of Louisiana's death row, ministering to condemned inmates. She wasn't following ambition or ideology. She was following a whisper, a call from Christ to see humanity even in those society had discarded. Her story reminds us that obedience sometimes leads us where we least want to go, but where grace waits to be found. The American heart wrestles with this tension every day. We are a nation of pioneers and believers, of rebellion and redemption. Our songs, our prayers, our politics all carry that contradiction. The longing to be free, yet the need to belong. But maybe freedom without obedience is not freedom at all. Maybe it's just another form of captivity, the captivity of self. There's a story told in many churches across the Midwest. A farmer loses everything in a storm: his fields, his barn, his harvest. Kneeling in the wreckage, he prays, "Lord, I don't understand, but I trust you." Months later, the same land brings forth a crop richer than ever before. People call it luck. He calls it grace. That's what obedience looks like in real life. Not perfection, but perseverance. In the gospel, the Roman centurion comes to Jesus and says, "I am not worthy for you to enter under my roof, but only say the word, and my servant will be healed." Jesus marvels and says, "I have not found such faith in all of Israel." Why? Because that man understood authority. He knew that true obedience recognizes real power, and that power belongs to God alone. In the noise of modern America, obedience is countercultural. It doesn't trend on social media. It doesn't win applause. But in quiet hearts, it still builds miracles. The mother forgiving a child, the pastor serving a poor parish, the worker who refuses corruption even when no one is watching. These are acts of holy obedience. Dear friends, every generation searches for a savior. Sometimes that search leads to God, but sometimes it leads to a mirror. In our age of technology and self-empowerment, the line between worshiping God and worshiping ourselves has never been thinner. The modern world tells us that we can be anything, do anything, control everything. But when humanity forgets its creator, it begins to crown itself as king. In America, this temptation hides in plain sight. It's in the culture of celebrity, in the rise of personality-driven movements, even in the way some preachers trade the gospel of humility for the gospel of success. Social media turns charisma into authority, and millions follow voices that promise comfort without conversion. They say, believe in yourself, but rarely surrender to God. And slowly the center shifts from faith in the divine to faith in human power. This isn't new. The scriptures tell of Babel, where people built a tower reaching toward heaven, saying, let us make a name for ourselves. They didn't hate God. They just wanted to replace him. And every time humanity does that, the tower falls. The echo of Babel can still be heard today in Silicon Valley boardrooms dreaming of digital immortality, in politicians who claim they alone can save the nation, in influencers who promise meaning without morality. Modern America, for all its brilliance, wrestles with the same ancient pride. We are the nation that split the atom and mapped the stars, yet struggles to find peace in the human heart. We can communicate instantly across oceans, but many souls still feel desperately alone. In the words of theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but man's inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary. The tension of good and evil runs through every human heart. That is why the Church continues to warn against the cult of personality. As the U.S. bishops remind us, no man can stand in the place of Christ. No movement can replace the cross. When faith turns a leader into an idol, it stops being faith. It becomes fanaticism dressed in religion. History bears witness. From Jim Jones to David Koresh, from self-proclaimed prophets to prosperity preachers, every false messiah begins the same way, with charisma, with promises, with pride. But even outside religion, the same spirit lives on. In the tech world, new messiahs promise salvation through innovation. They say that artificial intelligence will solve suffering, that data will redeem humanity, that progress will outgrow morality. Yet as philosopher C.S. Lewis once warned, the man who says he is as good as God does not rise, he sinks. The greatest danger of our age is not that we will lose faith, but that we will place it in ourselves. There's a quiet irony here. While the world builds monuments to human greatness, true greatness still hides in humility. Think of Mother Teresa walking the streets of Calcutta, holding dying beggars in her arms. She had no power, no wealth, no platform. And yet her life moved nations. Or consider the story of Father Michael Judge, the Catholic priest who ran into the World Trade Center on 9/11 to give last rites. As the towers fell, he whispered prayers over the dying. His obedience was his heroism. His surrender was his strength. America loves heroes, and rightly so. But the truest heroes are not those who make themselves gods. They are those who let God shine through their humanity. When Christ knelt to wash the feet of his disciples, he redefined greatness forever. Leadership became service. Power became sacrifice. In a world obsessed with climbing, he chose to kneel. The gospel reminds us that every false messiah, ancient or modern, shares one mark. They lead people toward themselves. The true Messiah leads people toward the Father. The difference is everything. The false Messiah says, "Follow me and I will give you power." The true Christ says, "Follow me and I will give you peace." In our culture of self-made success, it takes courage to choose surrender, to say, "I am not my own savior." But that courage is the beginning of freedom, because when we stop pretending to be gods, we finally allow God to be God. And in that humility, miracles return. Dear friends, humanity was never meant to carry the weight of divinity. The cross belongs to Christ alone. Our task is not to play God, but to reflect Him, to bring light into workplaces, kindness into families, mercy into politics. When we do that, faith becomes not an escape from the world, but its redemption. Maybe the modern world doesn't need another genius, or influencer, or revolution. Maybe what it needs most is a generation of saints, men and women humble enough to listen, brave enough to love, and faithful enough to obey. Dear friends, there's a question that echoes across every generation, whispered in hospital rooms, shouted in wars, and carried in the loneliness of the human heart. Where is God? It is not a question of unbelief. It is a cry of longing. And in modern America, where we have more noise, more screens, more connections than ever before, that question has grown louder than the answers we've been giving. In a culture built on instant communication, silence feels like absence. When prayers seem unanswered, people assume heaven has gone quiet. Yet as the mystics have reminded us for centuries, God often speaks most clearly when the world stops talking. The silence of God is not the absence of God, it is the space where faith learns to breathe. Psychologists in the United States now call it the epidemic of loneliness. According to the U.S. Surgeon General, nearly half of American adults report feeling isolated or unseen. The irony is staggering. We can FaceTime across oceans, yet many can't find someone to listen across the street. Technology connects bodies, but not always souls. The more we fill our lives with noise, the harder it becomes to hear the whisper of grace. C.S. Lewis once said, "God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains." Perhaps the silence of God is not a punishment, but a preparation. Maybe in that stillness, He is forming something within us that noise would only destroy. When we pray and feel nothing, when we seek and see nothing, it may be because He wants us to love Him not for His gifts, but for His presence. American writer Flannery O'Connor understood this paradox well. Her stories are filled with flawed characters, violent, proud, desperate, who only find grace when their illusions collapse. She once wrote, "All human nature vigorously resists grace because grace changes us, and the change is painful." That pain, that silence, that confusion, it is the sound of transformation. Think about the story of Elijah on Mount Horeb. The prophet expected God in the earthquake, in the fire, in the storm, but God came in a whisper. America, with its restless energy and constant motion, is not unlike that mountain. We search for God in success, in spectacle, in the extraordinary. Yet He waits for us in the quiet spaces, between breaths, between words, between the moments we dare to stop striving. After 9/11, many Americans asked, "Where was God?" Some said He was absent, but amid the smoke and rubble, others found Him in the faces of firefighters who ran toward danger, in the hands that lifted debris, in the chaplain praying over the dying. God was not gone. He was suffering with us, silent but present. There's a story told by a soldier returning from war. He said, "When I couldn't feel God in the battlefield, I realized later He was the one carrying me off it." That is the mystery of divine silence. It often hides in mercy. The same God who seemed distant in pain turns out to have been closest all along. In American life, where productivity defines worth, silence feels useless. We fill every minute, every space, every thought. But silence is where truth begins. In monasteries across the U.S., from the Abbey of Gethsemane in Kentucky to the New Camaldoli Hermitage in California, men and women take vows of silence not to escape the world, but to listen more deeply to it. They remind us that stillness is not emptiness, it's the doorway to presence. Maybe what the modern heart needs most is not another argument for God, but an encounter with Him. Not proof, but presence. Not words, but wonder. When the noise of politics, media, and fear fades, the soul finally hears again the voice that has never stopped speaking. Be still and know that I am God. Dear friends, God's silence is not rejection, it's invitation. The invitation to trust when we cannot see, to love when we cannot feel, to hope when the world seems hopeless. Every saint, Every believer, every soul that has ever known God has walked through that silence. It is not the end of faith, it is the beginning of intimacy. So if you find yourself praying and hearing nothing, waiting and feeling nothing, remember this: silence is God's classroom. And sometimes, the greatest miracle is not that He speaks, but that we learn to listen. Dear friends, when everything falls apart, hope can feel like a stranger. The ruins of a life, whether built from broken dreams, grief, or guilt, can seem too heavy to move, too final to rebuild. Yet the story of faith has always been written in the language of resurrection. It begins not in triumph, but in ashes. America knows something about rebuilding. The skyline of New York City, rising after September 11th, stands as more than an architectural triumph. It is a sermon in steel and glass. It tells us that hope can rise from dust, that courage can outlive fear. But even deeper than monuments or memorials, there are quiet rebuildings happening every day. In hospitals, in recovery centers, in homes where forgiveness finally returns after years of silence. Hope in ruins is not optimism. It is not pretending the pain never happened. Hope looks straight into the wound and still whispers, "This is not the end." When Jesus stood before the tomb of Lazarus, He didn't hide His tears. He wept first, then He called forth life. That's the rhythm of redemption. Tears before triumph, silence before song, the cross before the crown. In the years after Hurricane Katrina, the city of New Orleans became a living parable of this truth. The storm destroyed nearly everything: homes, schools, churches. But what followed was a flood of compassion. Strangers became neighbors. Volunteers became family. People who had lost everything began rebuilding, not just walls, but communities. In one interview, a survivor said, "The water took my house, but it didn't take my faith." That's the voice of grace speaking through the rubble. Sociologists at the Pew Research Center once found that Americans who endure hardship often report deeper faith afterward. It's as if suffering strips away the unnecessary, leaving only what's eternal. The psychologist Viktor Frankl, who survived the Holocaust, wrote, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." That truth is timeless, and it echoes every time a human heart refuses to let despair win. The Church calls this mystery redemptive suffering, the belief that God does not waste pain. Even in tragedy, something sacred is being formed. The U.S. bishops have often reminded the faithful that the Christian cross is not a decoration, but a declaration, that love can conquer death, and life can return where it seems impossible. In small towns across America, you can see this hope woven into everyday life. A widow plants a tree in her backyard in memory of her husband. A veteran opens a shelter for other soldiers lost to trauma. A recovering addict starts mentoring teenagers at risk. None of them erase the ruins, but they turn them into gardens. Hope is not found in avoiding pain, but in discovering purpose within it. That's why faith still speaks so powerfully in a nation that has known both prosperity and heartbreak. From the Dust Bowl to the Great Depression, from civil rights struggles to pandemics, America's story has been one of falling and rising, breaking and rebuilding. It's not perfection that defines the spirit, it's persistence. And somewhere deep inside that persistence lies grace. Grace that whispers to the brokenhearted, "You are not finished yet." Grace that turns tombs into doorways, disasters into testimonies. Grace that makes it possible to smile again, even with scars. There's a reason the cross stands at the center of Christian faith. It's the reminder that God's greatest victory began on the darkest day. On Good Friday, everything looked lost: betrayal, injustice, silence. But 3 days later, the impossible happened, and that story has never stopped repeating itself in human lives. Dear friends, if you are standing among ruins today, of a dream, a relationship, a past you cannot change, remember this: God builds best with broken things. The cracks of your heart are not signs of failure, but places where His light can enter. The hope of the gospel is not that we will never fall again. It's that when we do, love will always reach lower to lift us higher. The same Spirit that raised Christ from the dead still moves in the rubble of our lives, still whispers through the dust, still calls us by name. And when we dare to believe that, the ruins no longer define us. They become reminders. Reminders that grace is stronger than grief, that light is braver than darkness, and that even in the smallest act of faith, God begins to rebuild the world again. Dear friends, of all the virtues that faith calls us to practice, forgiveness may be the hardest. It asks us to do what feels impossible, to release the very pain that defines us. In a world that prizes justice and independence, forgiveness can look like weakness. But the gospel tells another story, that forgiveness is not surrender to injustice, it is freedom from its chains. In the United States, where every courtroom bears the words, "In God we trust," justice has always been a national virtue. Yet even here, people are discovering that no law can heal what bitterness destroys. Forgiveness is not the denial of wrong. It is the refusal to let wrong define who we are. After the tragic shooting at Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina in 2015, the world witnessed one of the most profound acts of grace in modern America. Families of the victims stood in court and faced the young man who had murdered their loved ones. One by one, they spoke words no one expected to hear. "I forgive you." Through tears and trembling voices, they chose mercy over vengeance. That moment silenced the world because it revealed something divine in human form. How do people find such strength? Psychologists studying trauma in America say forgiveness is not forgetting, it is reorienting the soul. It's turning from the past toward the possibility of healing. Dr. Everett Worthington, a leading researcher on forgiveness at Virginia Commonwealth University, calls it emotional release through compassion. He lost his own mother to murder, yet later forgave the killer. When asked how, he said, "Because hatred is too heavy to carry into eternity." Forgiveness doesn't erase pain, it transforms it. In Catholic teaching, this is what it means to redeem suffering. The U.S. bishops often remind believers that mercy is not a feeling but a decision, a deliberate act that mirrors the heart of Christ. When Jesus hung on the cross, bleeding from injustice, he whispered words that still challenge the human heart. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." American culture values strength, the strength to fight, to win, to rise. But the greatest strength is the one that kneels, not conquers. Forgiveness is not the end of the story, it's the beginning of resurrection. It's how dead things come alive again. In 2006, in the quiet town of Nickel Mines, Pennsylvania, a gunman entered an Amish schoolhouse and killed 5 young girls before taking his own life. The very next day, the Amish community visited the killer's family, offering condolences and forgiveness. They attended his funeral. They even raised money to support his widow and children. Reporters from around the world called it incomprehensible. But for the Amish, it was obedience to Christ's command. Forgiveness wasn't optional. It was the only way to live free from hatred. That story shook America because it revealed how radical grace truly is. In a world where outrage dominates headlines, forgiveness rarely trends. But deep down, the human heart longs for it. It's why we love redemption stories. It's why we cry at movies where enemies embrace, where lost sons return home, where second chances still exist. We recognize truth when we see it, because we were made for mercy. Forgiveness is not always dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet, like a daughter visiting the father who left years ago, or 2 friends finally speaking after decades of silence. In these moments, the miracle is invisible to the world, but heaven sees it. Every act of forgiveness rewrites a story of pain into a testimony of love. The great American writer Maya Angelou once said, "Forgive yourself for not knowing what you didn't know before you learned it.". Sometimes the hardest forgiveness is the one we owe ourselves. We replay our failures, our guilt, our shame as if suffering could make us holy. But God does not dwell in our regret. He dwells in our return. When Pope John Paul II was shot in 1981, he later visited his attacker in prison. Sitting face to face, he held the man's hands and said, "I forgive you." That moment, broadcast around the world, was not a display of power. It was a revelation of grace. True forgiveness disarms the world's logic. It ends the cycle of vengeance and begins the cycle of healing. Dear friends, forgiveness is the hardest miracle because it requires faith in the unseen. It asks us to believe that justice and mercy can coexist, that love can still win after loss. But every time we forgive, we create space for resurrection, not just in others, but within ourselves. The cross stands as the eternal symbol of that miracle. It is where divine justice met divine mercy and called it love. When we forgive, we become most like Christ, not when we are perfect, but when we love the imperfect. And in that moment, heaven touches earth. Dear friends, there are truths that can be proven, and then there are truths that can only be lived. Love belongs to the second kind. It cannot be measured, calculated, or contained, yet it is the one force that has never stopped shaping the story of humanity. Every culture tries to explain it, but every heart already knows. Real love is never logical, and that is precisely what makes it divine. In modern America, love is everywhere, and yet somehow it's missing. We sing about it, stream it, market it, but we still ache for the real thing. Movies tell us love is a feeling. Social media turns it into performance. But the gospel dares to say something deeper. Love is not what we feel, it's what we choose. It is sacrifice. It is service. It is the quiet decision to will the good of another, even when it costs us something. This truth has been written in both scripture and history. On the night before he died, Jesus knelt to wash the feet of those who would soon betray him. No act could be more logical. God washing the dust off human feet. But that's what love does. It stoops, it serves. It doesn't demand equality before it gives compassion. That single moment redefined greatness forever. Across America, you can still see that same love breaking through the ordinary. It's the paramedic holding the hand of a stranger in the back of an ambulance. It's the grandmother raising her grandchildren with joy after losing everything. It's the volunteer serving meals to the homeless on Thanksgiving, long after everyone else has gone home. None of these people are famous, but each of them is living proof that divine love still walks the earth disguised as human kindness. Theologian Thomas Merton, writing from his Kentucky monastery, once said, "Our job is to love others without stopping to inquire whether or not they are worthy." That sentence cuts through centuries of division, politics, and fear. It is radical because it mirrors the love of Christ himself, a love that doesn't wait for perfection before embracing the imperfect. We live in an age of polarization. America today feels more divided than it has in decades, over beliefs, race, politics, identity. Everyone has an opinion, and everyone wants to be right. But love doesn't take sides. Love builds bridges. The civil rights movement taught us that. When Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. preached nonviolence, he wasn't being naive. He was being prophetic. He believed that love was not weakness. It was weaponized mercy. It was the only power strong enough to shame hatred without becoming hatred. And he was right. The logic of vengeance multiplies pain. The logic of love ends it. That's why love always looks foolish to the world. It forgives enemies. It prays for those who persecute. It gives away the coat when someone demands the shirt. It dies on a cross for people who mock it. And yet, 2,000 years later, it is the only story still changing lives. Even in our secular age, the deepest moments of American life still return to love. After natural disasters, people form human chains to rescue strangers. After shootings, cities gather in candlelight vigils, hand in hand. When tragedy strikes, instinctively, we remember who we are. Not Democrats or Republicans, not rich or poor, but human beings capable of mercy. Psychologists at Harvard studying happiness found something remarkable. The strongest predictor of lifelong joy is not wealth, success, or status. It's love given and received. Faith already knew this truth. St. John wrote, "Whoever does not love does not know God, for God is love." Not has love, is love, which means every act of compassion is a glimpse of His presence. And perhaps that's why real love always costs something. It demands vulnerability in a world that rewards self-protection. It asks us to stay when walking away would be easier. It invites us to trust even after being hurt. But when we love like that, beyond logic, beyond comfort, beyond ego, we touch eternity. Dear friends, if you want to know where God is in this world, look for love that makes no sense. The love that forgives without condition. The love that shows up without applause. The love that keeps choosing to believe that light is stronger than darkness. Because that kind of love is not human, it's holy. It's the heartbeat of heaven, still echoing in human form. And when we choose to love that way, we don't just follow Christ, we reveal Him. Dear friends, faith is easy when life feels light. It's easy to believe when prayers are answered quickly, when health is steady, when the road ahead looks clear. But faith truly begins when the lights go out, when the diagnosis comes, when the job is lost, when the loved one doesn't come home. It's in those moments, the fire of life, that belief stops being theory and becomes truth. Across the vast landscape of America, there are countless people walking through that fire right now. A mother in Texas praying over her son's hospital bed. A coal miner in West Virginia trying to find hope after another layoff. A veteran in California battling nightmares long after the war has ended. Their faith doesn't live in stained glass cathedrals. It breathes in the messy, unfiltered places of pain. The Bible tells us that when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown into the fiery furnace, they didn't burn. Instead, a fourth figure appeared beside them, one like a son of God. The message is timeless. God doesn't always keep us out of the fire, but He always joins us in it. In modern America, that story still repeats itself. After the wildfires in California, families stood on the ashes of their homes and held hands, singing hymns. After hurricanes in the South, strangers from across the country drove thousands of miles just to help rebuild. When tragedy strikes, faith in this nation does not disappear. It gets tested, purified, and reborn. Sociologists studying religious resilience in the United States found that faith communities often grow stronger after disaster. Why? Because suffering strips away illusions. It forces people to decide whether they believe in comfort or in God. And when they choose God, their faith becomes unbreakable. The American theologian Reinhold Niebuhr once wrote, "Nothing worth doing is completed in our lifetime. Therefore, we are saved by hope." That line captures what every believer walking through fire eventually learns. Faith is not a feeling. It's a decision to keep walking, even when you can't see the end. Consider the story of Horatio Spafford, a lawyer from Chicago in the 1800s. After losing his fortune in the Great Fire and his 4 daughters in a shipwreck, he wrote one of the world's most beloved hymns, "It Is Well With My Soul." In the middle of unimaginable grief, his pen didn't write bitterness, it wrote peace. That's what faith through fire looks like. In American churches today, pastors often speak about refiner's fire, a phrase drawn from the prophet Malachi. It describes how gold is purified, not by avoiding heat, but by enduring it. The fire burns away the impurities, leaving only what's real. That's what God does in our trials. He's not punishing us, He's perfecting us. And sometimes the people who walk through the hottest fires become the ones who shine brightest. Corrie ten Boom, who survived a Nazi concentration camp, later traveled the world preaching forgiveness. When asked how she could still believe in God after such horror, she answered softly, "There is no pit so deep that God's love is not deeper still." That truth belongs not just to one woman, but to every soul that has walked through suffering and still chosen love. In American life, hardship often becomes a badge of honor. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. But faith takes it deeper. Faith says, what doesn't kill you can make you holier. The strength that endures loss and still loves, that buries its dead and still sings, that sees no light but still walks forward, that is the faith that changes the world. During the darkest hours of the civil rights movement, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. preached, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." He said those words not because he sought victory, but because he believed in a God who could bring it. Faith like that doesn't deny pain. It redeems it. It turns every wound into witness, every cross into resurrection. Dear friends, if you are walking through fire today, don't mistake the heat for abandonment. The flames that threaten to destroy you may be the very ones that refine you. The same God who stood with the 3 men in Babylon stands with you now, in hospital rooms, in empty houses, in quiet tears. The fire does not mean God is gone. It means He is near enough to feel what you feel, to burn away your fear, to forge your soul into something stronger. When faith walks through fire, it doesn't come out the same. It comes out radiant. And one day, when the smoke clears and the ashes settle, you'll realize what every saint and survivor has known. The fire was never meant to end you. It was meant to reveal you. Dear friends, every story has an ending. But in the story of God, the ending is never despair. It is always redemption. When we look back over the journey of faith, from the moments of doubt to the fires of suffering, from pride to surrender, one truth stands like a mountain above it all. Grace always has the last word. Grace is the heartbeat of every miracle. It is the quiet thread weaving through all the chaos of our lives, the whisper that says, even this can be made new. In America, a land that has seen both greatness and grief, grace has always been the force that holds the broken together. It has shown itself in movements for justice, in acts of compassion, in the resilience of people who refuse to stop believing in goodness. Think of the moments that define this nation's spirit. A nurse holding the hand of a dying patient during the pandemic. A police officer kneeling in prayer after saving a life. Communities rebuilding after hurricanes, floods, or fires. None of these stories made the front page for long, but heaven remembers them. They are the quiet triumphs of grace, the victories that no power, no politics, no darkness can undo. In Scripture, the Apostle Paul wrote, "Where sin increased, grace abounded all the more." That means nothing is beyond God's reach. Not our failures, not our shame, not our worst mistakes. The same hands that shaped the stars can still reshape a human heart. That's why grace is not a second chance, it's a new beginning. The American theologian Henry Nouwen once said, "Grace is when you discover that you are already loved before you do anything to deserve it." That's the scandal of grace. It can't be earned, only received. The world teaches merit, God teaches mercy. The world rewards success, God restores the fallen. Across the country, stories of grace keep unfolding every day. In prisons, where chaplains pray with men who thought their lives were over. In recovery centers, where addicts find freedom and faith. In small rural churches, where widows share their last loaf of bread with a stranger. In each of these places, grace is not a theory. It's the pulse of resurrection. And even when the world seems lost in noise and conflict, grace keeps moving quietly through the cracks. Like sunlight through broken glass, it turns every fracture into beauty. That is how God works. He does not discard what's broken, He transforms it. There's a story from the American South about a potter who repairs shattered vases using melted gold. The cracks don't disappear, they become the most beautiful part of the vessel. The Japanese call this kintsugi. We might call it divine craftsmanship. That is what grace does. It doesn't erase our scars, it redeems them. The cross itself is the greatest proof. What the world saw as defeat, God turned into deliverance. The nails meant for death became the doorway to eternal life. The stone rolled over the tomb could not hold back the sunrise. That's the final word of grace. Resurrection always wins. In a divided and weary world, people often ask, can love really change anything? The answer has not changed for 2,000 years. Yes, it already has. Every act of forgiveness, every moment of mercy, every choice to love when hate would be easier. It all joins the eternal victory of Christ, who conquered death not by power, but by love. Dear friends, grace is not just God's gift. It is His invitation. An invitation to live differently, to see others not as enemies but as souls, to bring healing instead of judgment, to speak hope instead of fear. When we accept that invitation, we become co-authors of redemption, writing small, luminous stories in the great book of God's love for the world. So let this be our prayer, that when history closes its pages on our generation, it will say not that we were flawless, but that we were faithful. Not that we were perfect, but that we were merciful. And that in our time, grace found another voice. Through us. May the God of mercy, through the intercession of the Blessed Virgin Mary and Saint Joseph, bless you and your families. May He pour out His peace upon your homes, His light into your hearts, and His strength into your struggles. And as we close this journey, let us remember, grace has no ending. Its story continues in your kindness, in your prayers, in every choice to love again. If these words have touched your heart, please share them. Let us together spread the light of Christ in a world that still waits for hope. Subscribe, leave a comment, and join this community of faith. Let us be witnesses of love, because when love is shared, God is revealed. Dear friends, as we reach the end of this journey, let us pause, not in silence, but in awe. We have walked together through darkness and light, through pride and surrender, through loss, forgiveness, and love. From the chains of fanaticism to the freedom of grace, this has not been just a story about religion, it has been a story about the human heart. We began with questions about faith, fear, control, and the meaning of God's silence. And yet, here we stand, reminded that every question, every tear, every scar can become sacred when placed in the hands of grace. The road was never about arriving at perfection. It was about learning how to walk again, even with a limp, even through the fire. For the American soul, restless, searching, always reaching, the invitation remains the same. Be still and know that He is God. In the midst of a nation built on dreams, competition, and noise, there is still a quiet voice that calls us back to what truly matters. Not success, not certainty, but love. Real, costly, transforming love. This series was never meant to give you answers. It was meant to awaken something eternal within you. That part of your heart that still believes goodness wins, that still hopes mercy is stronger than anger, that still knows deep down you were made for more than survival. You were made for love. If you've listened with an open heart, you've already begun to see it. Grace is not a story in a book. It's the sunrise after grief. It's the forgiveness you thought was impossible. It's the courage to believe again after disappointment. Grace is the rhythm of heaven set to the heartbeat of humanity. And so now, as we close this final chapter, I ask you to take a moment. Breathe in peace. Breathe out fear. Let the presence of God fill the quiet corners of your soul. You are not alone. You have never been alone. The one who carried you through the storm still walks beside you now. May the Lord Jesus Christ, through the loving intercession of the Blessed Virgin Mary, our Mother, and Saint Michael the Archangel, bless and protect you. May He pour out healing upon your wounds, light upon your darkness, and strength upon your weariness. And may His grace overflow from your heart into every life you touch. And now, dear friends, if this journey has moved you, inspired you, or helped you rediscover hope, please share it. Let us together be messengers of light in a world that often forgets how to see it. Click subscribe, leave a comment, and let your story join this mission. Because every word shared, every act of love, every prayer whispered in faith becomes part of something far greater, a movement of grace that never ends. Until we meet again, may the peace of Christ be with you always, and may his love continue to write the next chapter in you.